My daughter doesn't work there, my mother told the hospital administrator, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. She's just here to push my wheelchair. She's a bookkeeper, a junior one. The administrator looked at me. I handed her my ID. The color left her face so fast I thought she might need a bed herself. She picked up the phone and said, in a voice that carried down the entire corridor, "Dr. Mercer, I need you to come to reception immediately. We have the chief of neurosurgery checking in." My mother's hand went still on the wheelchair arm. She didn't say another word. But before I tell you how I got to that lobby and what happened after, hit that subscribe button, because what came next cost me 30 seconds and 30 years. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house that smelled like dryer sheets and disappointment. My father drove a Hydro One service truck and came home every evening with grease under his fingernails and a six-pack under his arm. He wasn't cruel. He was just somewhere else, present in body, absent in the way that counted. My mother, though, my mother was a performer. Everything she did was for an audience, even if that audience was only the neighbors through the kitchen window. My brother Curtis was 2 years younger than me and had the kind of easy, wide smile that made strangers stop on the sidewalk to compliment my mother on her handsome son. She received those compliments the way a plant receives water. She straightened, opened, leaned toward the light. I watched this happen so many times I stopped counting. When I was 11, I won the regional science competition with a model of the human brainstem I'd built over 6 weeks, from modeling clay and electrical wire, labeling every lobe and pathway in handwriting so small my teacher needed a magnifying glass to read it. I carried the ribbon home in a clear plastic sleeve, edges perfectly aligned. My mother was on the phone. She glanced at it, nodded once the way you nod at a stranger holding a door, and turned back to her call. That ribbon lived in a shoebox under my bed for 2 years before I threw it out myself. Curtis that same month got honorable mention in a regional hockey skills competition. Not the top prize, not even close. But my mother bought a frame from the craft store in New Sudbury and hung the certificate on the wall above the television where company would see it first thing walking in. She told the story of his skating for years. I heard her tell it to the hairdresser, to the church auxiliary, to the woman at the Tim Hortons counter who had not asked. That was the pattern. I was background. Curtis was the story. When I was 16, my father had his first cardiac event. Not a full heart attack. The paramedics called it a warning shot. He spent 4 days at Health Sciences North, and I spent all 4 evenings as a plastic chair beside his bed, doing his insurance paperwork, filing short-term disability forms, calling his union rep to make sure his benefits held. Curtis visited once, for 45 minutes. He cried in the hallway in a way that made the nurses come over and put their hands on his shoulders. He left with a hug from our mother and the title of man of the house. I drove home in the dark at 11:30 p.m., alone, having sorted 8 months of financial protection for my father in a waiting room. I let myself in through the back door, made tea, went to bed. Nobody had asked where I'd been. The shift inside me happened quietly, the way a river changes course, not all at once, just the slow, daily redirection of water finding the only path available. I decided I would disappear, not physically, strategically. I would compress myself so small that there would be no surface for their dismissal to land on. I would stop explaining, stop expecting, stop presenting ribbons. That decision would cost me more than I understood at 16. I got into McMaster's medical program on my first application. This was before the current competitive landscape made that nearly impossible. I received the offer letter by email on a Thursday afternoon in February, while I was sitting at the kitchen table doing calculus homework. The acceptance rate that year was under 6% for my cohort. I printed the email, walked it to the living room, and set it on the coffee table in front of my mother. She was watching a real estate show. She looked at the paper, she looked back at the screen, medicine. She said it like she was reading the word off a cereal box. Well, don't expect us to cover anything the student loan doesn't. Curtis has hockey camp this summer, and those fees aren't cheap. She turned the volume up. I folded the paper, put it in my backpack, and went upstairs. I did not cry. I lay on my bed for 11 minutes, looking at the ceiling, which I know because I watched the digital clock. Then I got up and started packing a list of things I would need in a residence room. I told myself this was discipline. It was not discipline. It was the beginning of a 30-year burial. Medical school in Hamilton was where I first understood what I was actually capable of. My professors didn't grade on enthusiasm or personality. They graded on performance, and performance was something I'd been quietly, privately, obsessively building since I was 11 years old, making a brain out of clay. I graduated near the top of my class, residency in neurosurgery at Toronto Western, fellowship in Montreal, a staff position at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, specializing in complex spinal and cranial surgery. None of this was information I shared at home. Not intentionally, or at least, that's what I told myself for years. The truth, the version I can only see clearly now, is that I had trained myself so thoroughly to be invisible that professional success felt like something I was hoarding, something they would find a way to diminish if they knew. So when my mother asked what I did, I said I worked in a hospital. When she pressed, and she rarely pressed because she was not that curious about me, I said I was in neurology, which was close enough to true that it didn't feel like a lie. Curtis knew I was a doctor. He'd let it slip once that I was some kind of brain doctor in Toronto. My mother filed this away the way she filed most things about me, briefly, distantly, without retention. She once introduced me to her friend from her book club as my daughter, the one who does something medical. The friend said, "Oh, how nice," and then spent 20 minutes asking Curtis about his property management company. His property management company, that's what he called it. Curtis managed 3 rental units he'd bought with money from our mother's home equity line of credit. He took 10% of rent collection and called himself a real estate entrepreneur. He had a logo and a website and a LinkedIn profile that listed him as CEO. He also had, as I would later learn, an approximately $340,000 debt spread across 2 lines of credit, a personal loan from our mother's retirement saves account, and a habit of calling me every 8 to 14 months with a financial emergency that he presented with the casual entitlement of someone ordering takeout. The first time he called, I was a second-year resident pulling 60-hour weeks and living in a basement apartment in the West End of Toronto. He needed $4,000 to cover a gap between a tenant leaving and the next one arriving. I transferred it. I told myself it was temporary. It was never temporary. Over 12 years, the transfers accumulated the way medical debt accumulates. Quietly, continuously, each one seeming manageable in isolation until you look at the total and feel the room tilt. $4,000 here, $11,000 there, $28,000 when his second unit needed a full roof replacement, and the insurance claim was denied because he'd missed a maintenance inspection. My mother called that one with a tremor in her voice she deployed like a tuning fork, the specific frequency designed to resonate somewhere behind my sternum. Curtis is in a real bind, sweetheart. You know how hard he works. I knew exactly how hard he worked. I had watched a surgeon remove a tumor the size of a plum from the base of a 42-year-old man's brainstem while I guided the retractor with my left hand for 6 hours without moving. I knew what hard work looked like. It looked nothing like Curtis. But I wired the money, and the next time, and the time after that. The total over 12 years was somewhere above $180,000. That number represents 12 years of weekend call shifts, of canceled vacations, of declining offers to buy a condo in the neighborhood I actually wanted to live in. It represents the money I earned in operating rooms, where the stakes were measured in whether someone woke up able to speak, to walk, to recognize their children. They didn't know any of this. As far as my mother and Curtis were concerned, I was comfortably employed at a hospital doing something related to medicine, probably filling in paperwork, and I had disposable income because I didn't have a family of my own and therefore had nothing to spend it on. I wasn't invisible to them. I was a utility. The moment everything changed came at Christmas 2 years ago. My mother had moved from Sudbury to Barrie to be closer to Curtis, who had moved there for the lower property taxes. She'd bought a small place on a court in a new subdivision, and Curtis had taken it upon himself to furnish it on my credit. I want to be precise about this. He did not ask me to fund the furniture. He told my mother it was taken care of, put $14,000 on a credit card I'd added him to 15 years ago for a one-time emergency and never removed him from, and sent me a photo of the living room couch with a thumbs-up emoji. No call. No explanation. A thumbs-up emoji. I drove up to Barrie for Christmas dinner. I had been on call Christmas Eve and done a 7-hour surgery that morning. A young woman, 29, meningioma posterior fossa, the kind that if you get it wrong takes her balance, her vision, her sense of self. I'd gotten it right. She was in recovery and would be going home to her family in Kelowna in 4 days. I pulled up to my mother's house at 4 p.m. Curtis's truck was in the driveway next to my mother's car, the new one, the lease he'd taken out under her name because his credit rating had been flagged. His wife, a woman named Rochelle, answered the door. She was wearing a sweater that had cost more than my on-call rate and carrying a glass of wine. "Oh," she said when she saw me. "We weren't sure you'd make it. Dinner's almost ready." She stepped back to let me in and called over her shoulder. "Curtis, your sister's here." I set my coat on the rack. Through the archway to the living room, I could see my mother in an armchair, the new armchair, the one from my credit card, holding court for Rochelle's parents, who had apparently also been invited. She was telling a story. She was laughing. She did not look up when I came in. Curtis appeared from the kitchen with a spatula in his hand. He was wearing an apron. He had a way of inserting himself into domestic scenes that made him look industrious and warm. "Hey, sis, you look tired." He squeezed my shoulder and went back to the kitchen. I looked tired. I had been awake for 31 hours and had just held a woman's brainstem in the palm of my hand, effectively. I looked tired because I was tired in a way that a man who spent his Tuesday mornings on a real estate investment podcast would have no framework to understand. Dinner was the usual theater. Curtis talked about a development project he was consulting on, no details, lots of implications. Rochelle's father, who worked in insurance, was impressed. My mother kept her hand near Curtis's arm the way she always had, that proprietary nearness, that confirmation of her ownership of his success. At some point, Rochelle's mother turned to me. "And what do you do, dear?" Before I could answer, my mother did it for me. She's in healthcare, hospital administration really. Mostly the paperwork side of medicines. She smiled in my direction, not at me, in my direction, and turned back to Rochelle's mother. Now Curtis was actually just telling us about a property opportunity in Innisfil, hospital administration, mostly the paperwork side. I held my fork. I ran the breathing pattern I learned from an anesthesiologist in my second year of residency, the one she used before difficult intubations. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, not because I was calm, because my hands needed to be steady and my face needed to betray nothing. I looked at my mother across the table. She was already talking about Innisfil. I did not correct her. But something I had been suppressing for 12 years had just crossed a threshold, the way pressure builds behind a door, silently, invisibly, until the door doesn't open anymore. It gives. 3 months later, my mother called to tell me she'd accepted an invitation. Through her book club, through a friend of a retired general's wife, some chain of social climbing I'd stopped being able to follow, to a gala hosted by the Canadian Neuroscience Foundation, the annual dinner. It was, in fact, one of the most significant events in my professional calendar. I had been asked to deliver the keynote address. She told me none of this. She told me she and Curtis were attending because the foundation was connected to some investors Curtis had been pursuing, and could I please accompany them to help navigate the venue, since she'd been having trouble with her hip. She did not know I was the keynote speaker. She did not know because I had never told her. The invitation mailed to my home had my name and my title on it in full. I had accepted 6 months earlier. I agreed to accompany them. I agreed because I had spent 30 years choosing strategic silence over honest confrontation, and I had one final use for it. The evening of the gala, I put on a dark dress and flat shoes and met them in the lobby of the Sheraton in downtown Toronto. My mother was in a blouse she'd had Rochelle help her choose. Curtis was in a suit I did not recognize, which meant he had bought it recently, and probably recently put it on a card in some configuration I would eventually discover. We arrived at the registration table. The volunteer there, a young woman, graduate student, name tag that said Kelsey, scanned the guest list for my mother's name. She found it. She gave my mother a lanyard that said guest in small print. She gave Curtis one that said guest. Then she looked at me. "And your name?" "Dr. Mercer," I said. My full name. First initial, last name, title. Kelsey's hands went still on her keyboard. She looked up. "Oh," she said. "Oh, I'm sorry, one moment." She reached for a different box, the one beside the registration table, the one I had not noticed. She pulled out a lanyard on a lanyard that was not the generic guest design. It had my name on it in a different typeface, and below my name, in bold, keynote speaker. She was already reaching for the phone. "Could you just hold on one moment, Dr. Mercer?" "I just want to." The foundation president asked us to alert her the moment you arrived. My mother looked at the lanyard, at the typeface, at my name, at keynote speaker. Her hands went very still in front of her. Curtis said nothing. He was looking at his phone, then he looked at the lanyard, then at my face, then back at the lanyard. Before I could say anything, the foundation's executive director, a woman named Sandra Fitch, who I'd known for 4 years through the medical community, came across the lobby at a walk that was close to a jog. She had the particular energy of someone who has just been told something important and is moving accordingly. "Isabel," she said when she reached me. She took both my hands. "We have been so looking forward to this. The room is going to love you." She turned, not to my mother, not to Curtis, and spoke to the volunteer. "Can we make sure Dr. Mercer is taken up to the reception suite? The other speakers are already there." She looked back at me, noticed my mother. Smiled politely in that way people smile when they are waiting for an introduction. I gave it to her, cleanly, without drama. "Sandra, this is my mother, and my brother Curtis." Sandra shook their hands, said it was lovely they could come. Then she put a gentle hand under my elbow and said, "Whenever you're ready, we'll head up." I looked at my mother. Her face had done something I had never seen it do before. It wasn't embarrassment. I knew that face. It wasn't even surprise. It was the specific physical expression of a person whose internal architecture has just been shown to be built on wrong measurements. A recalibration happening in real time, in the lobby of the Sheraton, surrounded by strangers in formal wear. "I'll see you both at dinner," I said. I turned and walked with Sandra toward the elevator bank. I did not look back. The reception suite was warm and full of people who had spent their careers in operating rooms and research labs, and the particular loneliness of knowing things that most people never have cause to think about. A colleague from St. Michael's saw me across the room and made his way over. Another surgeon I'd trained with in Montreal, the president of the foundation, a man named Dr. Osi, no relation to the file, who had nominated me for the keynote 2 years running before I finally accepted. I had a glass of sparkling water and stood in a room full of people who knew what I did and how I did it, and it was the most uncomplicated I had felt in years. When I walked to the podium, the room settled, not the polite hush of an audience being patient. The particular silence of people who are paying actual attention. I spoke about the brain, about what it means to work in the structure that generates identity, continuity, the sense of self. I spoke about patients who woke from surgery and didn't recognize the word for fork, who had to rebuild their relationship to language from the ground up, who called their surgical teams 6 months later to say they'd cooked dinner for the first time, or read a chapter of a book, or said their child's name without searching for it. I spoke about what it costs to do this work, and I meant it technically and personally both. I spoke about the years of not talking about what you do, because the gap between understanding and non-understanding can feel too large to cross, and about how that silence, if you let it run long enough, comes its own kind of damage. I did not look at the table in the back corner until the third paragraph. When I did, I found them. My mother and Curtis, guest lanyards visible even from the stage, seated at a round table near the side wall. My mother was looking at the projection screen behind me where the foundation had placed my official headshot beside my name and credential. Dr. Isabel Mercer, MD, FRCSC, Chief of Neurosurgery, St. Michael's Hospital, Toronto, Chief. Not administrator, not paperwork side of medicine, Chief. I had been Chief for 3 years. She was looking at the screen and her face was doing the recalibration again, slower this time, with more weight behind it. Curtis was very still. He had the fixed expression of a man who has spent the last hour discovering, through overheard conversations at the cocktail reception, that the investors he'd come here to network with all knew his sister personally and professionally, and that not one of them recognized his name when he offered it. The applause when I finished was long and warm. I shook hands, received the foundation's recognition pin, was pulled into photographs. Colleagues from Vancouver and Halifax and one from Edinburgh, who's visiting on a research exchange, asked about my current work. My mother found me in the corridor afterward, while the room was moving toward the dinner service. She was alone. I didn't see Curtis. She looked smaller than she had at the registration table. People compress under certain kinds of weight. I had watched it happen in family consultation rooms for years. The moment the information lands, the way the body adjusts its relationship to space. Isabel, her voice was different. Stripped of its usual undertone of mild impatience, the low-frequency signal she'd been broadcasting in my direction for as long as I could remember. Why didn't you tell me? I took my time before answering. Not for effect. Because the answer was more complex than the question deserved, and I wanted to say the truthful part. Because I spent 30 years making myself small enough that you wouldn't have to look at me. I thought that's what you needed. She pressed her lips together. I could see her working through something she did not have the language for. I told Margaret's mother that you were in hospital administration, she said. I know, at Christmas. You let me say that, I know. She looked away down the corridor. Curtis knew you were a surgeon? He knew I was a doctor. He didn't know what kind, he didn't ask. I paused. People tend to not ask about things they're not sure they want to know. She came to my apartment 6 days later. She called first, which she didn't always do, and when I opened the door, she was carrying a Tupperware container of butter tarts that she'd driven from Barrie to bring, which was a thing she had not done since I was in university. She sat at my kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea and didn't perform anything. She just sat. After a long time she said, Your grandfather was a doctor, did you know that? My father's father, in Antagonish. He died before you were born. She looked at her mug. I never talked about it because I was angry at him. He worked himself to nothing and left my grandmother alone for most of it. I decided medicine was a thing men did to abandon their families. She paused. That wasn't fair to put on you. I did not say it's fine, because it wasn't fine. But I understood, for the first time, where the particular angle of her dismissal had come from. It had a history I hadn't been given access to. Most of the things people do to us have histories we can't see. We didn't resolve 30 years that afternoon. That's not how it works, and I'm not going to tell you it is. But something shifted. She asked me, genuinely, what my job was like. Not hospital administration, not the paperwork side, my actual job. I told her about a patient, nothing that would identify her, who had come to me with a tumor pressing on her speech center. She was a music teacher. Her whole professional life lived in the part of her brain that was under pressure. The surgery took 11 hours. She was playing piano again in 4 months. My mother listened, actually listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, And you've been doing that? This whole time? Yes. While Curtis called you about the roof? Yes. She looked at the table. I am sorry, Isabel. I'm not sure I have the right words yet, but I want you to know that I know I need to find them. That was not a full apology. But it was honest, and honesty from her was rarer than apology would have been from someone else, so I held it accordingly. Curtis took longer. He is still in process, which is the most accurate thing I can say. He called 2 months after the gala. He did not open with a financial ask, which was itself something. He said, "I've been thinking about what it means that I didn't know what you do. And I think the honest answer is I didn't want to know, because knowing would have made it harder to ask." He was quiet. That's not something I'm proud of. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I was removing him from the credit card. He didn't argue. That was also something. The credit card, the automatic transfers, the 12 years of money wired from my call shift earnings into an account that financed someone else's performance of success. All of it, canceled. Terminated cleanly in the notes application on my phone at 11:47 p.m. in a hotel room in Ottawa, where I was presenting at a conference the following morning. No drama, no ultimatum delivered in tears. The same precision I apply to a cranial approach: locate the problem, understand the structure around it, make the cut cleanly, and trust the recovery. The thing I've learned about being seen, really seen, not just known of, is that it requires two things moving at once. Someone choosing to look, and you choosing to stop hiding. For most of my adult life, I had been doing only one half of that equation and calling it strength. Making myself invisible wasn't discipline. It was a strategy I'd adopted at 11 years old with a ribbon in a plastic sleeve, and I had simply never updated it. A few months after the gala, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. No Tupperware this time. Just her voice, with something in it I'd never quite heard before. Not softness, she isn't a soft person, but something less armored. She'd been at Curtis's, she said, helping him sort through some boxes from the storage unit he was downsizing. In one of the boxes, she'd found something that had apparently been packed away when they moved from Sudbury, a shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside it was a science fair ribbon, mine. From 1994, purple and white, still in the plastic sleeve. My name and the words "Regional First Place" printed on the label. She'd kept it. For 30 years, in a shoebox in a storage unit, in a city she'd left, she had kept it. She didn't have a grand explanation. She didn't try to construct one. She just said, "I don't know why I didn't say anything at the time. I think I didn't know how." And then, after a long pause, "I think I was afraid of you, Isabel, of what you were capable of." And I handled that badly. I held the phone for a moment without speaking. Outside my office window, the October sky over Toronto was flat and gray, and the CN Tower was half hidden in low cloud. I had a full surgical day starting in 40 minutes. "I know," I said. And I meant it the way you mean something when it finally makes sense, not as an absolution, not as a closure, but as a fact you can finally look at directly. "Will you come for Thanksgiving? Curtis will be there." A pause. "He's been cooking." Actually cooking, not just standing near the stove with a spatula. I said I would. I drove up to Barrie on the Saturday. The house smelled like roasting chicken and the particular softness of a home that is trying, imperfectly, to be something better than it was last year. My mother had done something to the living room wall, the wall where Curtis's old hockey certificates used to hang. It was different. There was a single frame in the center, a simple dark wood frame, and inside it was the first place ribbon from the regional science competition in 1994, still in its plastic sleeve, pressed flat. Nothing else on the wall, just that. Curtis came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder. He looked at me. He looked at the wall. "Mom did that," he said. "I helped her hang it this morning." He paused. "It's straight." I measured. We sat down to dinner, the three of us, plus Rochelle, who was quieter than I'd seen her, which told me that certain conversations had been happening in that house that I wasn't privy to and probably didn't need to be. Before we ate, my mother stood up. She does not make speeches. She has never made speeches. She stood with one hand on the back of her chair, looking at the table, and when she spoke, her voice was matter-of-fact in the way of someone saying a thing they have rehearsed enough times to get through without breaking. "This is my daughter," she said. "Dr. Isabel Mercer, Chief of Neurosurgery at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. She has spent her career going into the most complicated structure in the human body and coming back out with people's lives intact." She looked at me. I told people for years that she worked in hospital administration. I said it so many times I think I started to believe it myself. A pause. That was wrong. And it was a waste of 30 years of a story I should have been proud to tell. She sat down. Curtis poured the water. Rochelle passed the bread. Nobody said anything for a moment, which was the right thing. Then my mother picked up her fork and said, "Well, eat before it gets cold." And we did. The thing about spending 30 years making yourself small is that when you stop, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels more like taking off a coat you've worn so long you forgot it wasn't your skin. The cold hits first. Then, slowly, you start to feel the actual temperature of the room, what it is when nobody's managing it, nobody's performing for it. It turns out the room was warmer than I thought. Pride is not something that comes from outlasting people or being vindicated in a hotel lobby. I know because I've had both of those things now, and neither of them filled the particular space I'm describing. Pride, the real kind, the kind that holds, comes from the moment you decide that your work, your history, your 30 years, of crawling toward the hard thing and doing it anyway, is worth being known. Not by everyone, but by the people who are supposed to know you. I spent a long time believing my silence was a gift I was giving my family. I've learned finally that it was something else. It was the quietest possible way of agreeing with them. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this, leave it in the comments. Tell me what finally made you stop agreeing.